Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I am so glad that you could join us tonight for this very important program. It's a program that we've been talking about, Melissa and I and some of the other folks from Glenbard, and we're so glad that you could join us. This is a very worthwhile program, and thanks to John, we will be able to record this. It will be on the Glenbard Parent Series YouTube channel so that you can view it later and share it with a friend. All Glenbard parent programs are welcoming to every family everywhere. If you have a cousin who's across the street or across the country, we welcome you to share these weekly virtual programs with them. You saw the slide a minute ago of all of our sponsors. We are so grateful to them for making this possible. If you take a look at our brochure, you'll see the 50 programs that we organize each year. And if you go to glenbardgps.org, right now you will see all of the programming that has been organized for the 2023-24 school year. So you can circle your calendar and hope we'll see you back. Before we begin, just a few notes about what's coming up before the end of the year. Next week, we will be welcoming Dr. Carl Fisher. He has a book called The Urge, A Personal Story of Struggle. Dr. Fisher is an addiction psychiatrist. He's written a book about his own experiences. He'll be with us next week on Wednesday, the 26th at noon and at 7 p.m. And then the next week, we are welcoming back Phyllis Fagel. Phyllis Fagel has a new book. She's a true expert in middle school. And this book is called The Superpowers That Teens and Preteens Need, Strategies to manage setbacks and gain confidence. So Phyllis, you want to be there for that one on May 2nd at 7 p.m. and at noon. We just added, we've never done this before, but a return engagement. A few months ago, we welcomed Anna Lemke. She's the author of the book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in an Age of Indulgence. She will be with us for a noon special encore presentation on Thursday, May 18th. I also want to mention that we're having a film viewing at the Glen Ellen Public Library that's happening on May 20th. We'll be showcasing the film Live, a story of a family struggling with the suicide of a young woman in the family. Go to the Glen Ellen Public Library to register for that in-person event. And again, please share. Everyone's always welcome. We're going to get right into it. I can't wait. Let me introduce to you now Melissa Creech. She is the Executive Director for Teaching and Learning at the Glenbard Schools, and she'll be introducing John. Melissa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Gilda. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Spencer. Dr. Spencer has been making waves in the world of education for many years, having worked as a teacher, college professor, and educational consultant. He is the co-author of the best-selling books Empower and Launch, which we regularly use at Glenbard as part of our professional development for our educators. He also has a new book out called Vintage Innovation. He'll be talking to us tonight about the future and how creativity and innovation are necessary for our students as they prepare for our own students. So without any further ado, welcome, and please everyone welcome our inspiring and innovative speaker, John Spencer.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it so much. Good to be here. And we're going to be talking about this idea of empowering students today for the skills that they'll need tomorrow. And one of the things I'll get into real soon here is it's the notion of navigating the maze. It's the concept of what skills will students need as they navigate the maze of a complex and fast changing world. And I'm actually going to start out by a brief story of my own experience as a student that shaped so much of what I believe. And one sentence that changed my world forever. And although this is a story about a teacher, it's also a story in so many ways about my own parents and my mom in particular, and the role that she played in this. And I want you to see if you can kind of pick up on where that's coming from. So a little bit about me. I am a middle-aged man. I was born in the Ice Age. It's where I learned how to stop and collaborate and listen. It was a time when this bad boy was cutting edge, and the biggest technology concern I had was to not get dysentery on the Oregon Trail. This was me in the 8th grade. I was incredibly shy and incredibly nerdy. And we were actually talking about this ahead of time. Back then, if you think about the 1980s, the nerds were the tropes to be tolerated, not the characters to be loved, right? There was a clear social hierarchy back then. It's changed a lot where nerdiness is kind of embraced in our culture. You can be a jock and a nerd at the same time. But back then, it's the lowest spot on the hierarchy. And I had one friend, we'll call him Matt, since that's his name. And we were two nerds on a pod. We would nerd out on data from Star Trek TNG. We would talk about data from baseball cards. And my whole goal was to be invisible in middle school. 6th grade rolls around, it's working. 7th grade rolls around, same thing. 8th grade rolls around, this plan is working perfectly. Matt has perfect attendance, right? He is the kid that gets the congratulations on your immune system certificate at the end of each year. And so my plan is working perfectly until Matt catches a cold the first week of 8th grade. Now, he's only gone for 1 day, but I have no idea what to do. I remember standing there looking in the cafeteria where he and I always sat, and he wasn't there. And I stood out and I looked at the sea of students all around, and I waited for someone to invite me to the table. People started crowding behind me. They started pushing and shoving, and I was frozen. And so I took my food, I threw it away, I slid my cafeteria tray, and I hid out in the boys' restroom, waiting for those 22 painfully long minutes to go by. I was saved by the bell. There's a little 80s reference right there. And I wiped my eyes and I headed back into class. Now, I wanted to be invisible, and I was invisible as a kid, but not to Mrs. Smoot or to Mr. Darrow. They knew me as a person. They knew I loved baseball. They knew I cared about justice and issues in the world, and they knew that I enjoyed history. So they invited me to be a part of the National History Day project. And in this project, Mrs. Smoot gave me a warning. She said, John, you are going to work harder on this project than you've ever worked before. And she was absolutely right. At first, I was frustrated by this project. The truth is, it was really challenging. I would love to say that I enjoyed having voice and choice in my work, but I didn't. I wanted a teacher to give me the answers. I wanted a teacher to tell me exactly what I needed to do. I was good at following directions. I was that kid who got A's in the classes I liked, B's in the classes that I didn't care as much about. And I knew that going to college, getting into a decent university was the big plan for my future. And yet I had never been empowered with voice and choice. Eventually, I narrowed down the topic to the story of Jackie Robinson, the integration of baseball, and I fell in love with the topic. I fell in love with history. I fell in love with research, and I began to develop these critical skills that I had never had before. I was so shy, but yet I was forced to interview people, to talk to all of these former baseball players and face my fears. I had never engaged in project management before, and now I was learning and owning the process of project management. I remember one day where I had writer's block, and I was supposed to write my script for this project, and I went to Mrs. Smoot and I said, I don't feel like doing this project today. I don't feel like writing. And she said, John, the nice thing about writing is you can do it whether you feel like it or not. Writer's block is a code word for fear. All I want from you is 200 mediocre words. Now, what was she doing in that moment? She was providing me with slack so I could develop grit. I came home and I was so frustrated that she had made me do the work. And my mom said, good, that's what should happen. Or I think about the moment when I was confused at the very beginning about what topic to choose. And I came home and I said, Mom, my teachers won't help me. And she said, good, you're going to have to figure it out yourself. Eventually, we got to go to a radio studio, and I had interviewed probably 50 different baseball players. I had read every article I could read. I had thrown myself into this project. I had worked on it all year. And now all I had to do was record my script at the radio studio. And then I recorded it and I heard it played back, and I could hear everything wrong with my voice. I could hear my stuttering. I could hear my voice crack. I could hear my braces coming through. I could feel the memories of being in speech therapy when I was younger and wondering if maybe my voice will never be good enough. And so in that moment, I looked at Mrs. Smoot and I said, I quit. And she said this sentence that stuck with me forever. She said, John, when you hide your voice, you rob the world of your creativity. And I'm not going to let you do that. So what did she do again? She gave me slack so I could develop grit. I re-recorded my script. And what I did is I rehearsed it over and over and over and over again. And one by one, all of the students had finished recording their script. And I was still in the studio working on this with Mrs. Smoot and with the audio engineer and continuing to work on it until finally I had something I was proud of. It was time to present. And I remember the room was dark. I had my slide carousel right here. Students streamed in. And my hand was shaking so bad that when I put my cassette in the boombox and I tried to click forward on the slide carousel, it went backward instead of forward. And now everything I was afraid of began to happen. Laughter, whispering. And it felt like an eternity, but it was about 10 seconds into it when I found it. Slide number 2, click. Pulse pounding, heart hammering, click. Muscle memory kicks in, click. I've got it. And when it's done, to my surprise, I get a standing ovation. And in that moment, I recognized I wasn't invisible. I went on to do the competition. I was not supposed to do the competition. I was only supposed to present to the class. That was part of the deal I had made with my teacher. If I didn't want to, I didn't have to. And the truth is, when I presented to the class, the paperwork was already due. And I went up to Mrs. Smoot and I said, I want to do the competition. And she said, well, the paperwork was due a month ago. And the good news is, over a month ago, your mom filled out the paperwork and you're good to go. You're going to do the competition. I won the competition. I won the state of California competition, and I got to present in Washington, D.C. And that changed my world forever. I share that story because all of the technology skills I learned, I don't have to use anymore. I cannot think of the last time I had to navigate the dark art of microfilm or microfiche. I can't think of the last time I had to unjam a projector. When I make a slide presentation, I draw everything, I scan it, I put it in Photoshop, or I draw straight onto the iPad. Back then I had to take actual pictures, take it to the drugstore, get the film developed into these little slides that I would use. So all of the technology I used back then is now obsolete. But you know what's not obsolete? Those critical skills I learned: how to think, how to collaborate, how to ask questions, how to do research, how to communicate, how to be creative, how to be adaptable, and how to persevere in the moments when things aren't working. The truth of the matter is our world is changing. If you think about it this way, all of these things require something physical just a decade or two ago. I still remember the day that my daughter, who's now 14, she brought an iPad out to me. She was in kindergarten at the time, and she said, "Dad, you got to play this amazing game. It's called Crossy Road." And I played it for about, I don't know, a minute before I realized, no, this is just Frogger. It's now on an iPad. Or I remember the day that my wife and I were bragging about how great we are on road trips and feeling better about, how we do on road trips compared to our parents and how they used to argue. And finally, my wife turned to me and she said, "Well, John, you know why that's the case. We don't have to argue over a map." And I was like, oh my gosh, Google saved our marriage. That's amazing. Or I think about the day that my daughter asked the question, "Dad, were you alive back when people had flip phones?" My kids will never know the struggle of spending hours with your thumb on that record button, listening to the music, making that epic mixtape. Now they can just say, "Alexa, play my favorite song." We didn't have Alexa, we didn't have Siri, we had Clippy, and he was the passive aggressive assistant who would say, "Oh, it looks like you're trying to make a letter. Good luck." Now, why is this the case? All of these things are changing. And for years, we've had this one-size-fits-all model of education, where kids are supposed to passively learn content and regurgitate it back. But one-size-fits-all is great for socks, but not a great model for minds. We think about it this way. Most of us, when we were in school, we were taught this formula. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly: work hard at school, graduate from college, and climb the corporate ladder. Now, I want to be clear. All of these are still important, right? Working hard at school is still important. College is still important. And finding your career is still important. But this model has changed. And with all of the changes connecting to machine learning and AI, the ladder is now a maze. So I would love for you to share in the chat right now, if we think about the ladder becoming a maze with all of these changes in technology, what are some of the skills that students will need as they navigate this maze? What are some of the skills that they'll need as they navigate this maze? Love this. Flexibility, empathy, collaboration. Love these ideas, right? Problem solving, absolutely. Now, I gotta tell you, as a dad, this is scary to me because this is predictable, right? I've got a senior in high school. So my kids, I forgot to mention this, they are almost 18 and then 16 and 14. And I gotta say, my 18-year-old, I would prefer the stability of this formula. The scary thing is that the game has changed and the rules are gone. But the exciting thing is my son gets to rewrite those rules. Your kids will get to rewrite those rules. And that to me is an exciting possibility. Now, bear with me for just 1 second. I'm going to talk about baseball because I think this makes a difference, and I'm going to get here. All right. So if you don't enjoy sports, just bear with me for a brief moment. This is the Astrodome. This was the space age stadium. It was the future. It was supposed to be the future of baseball. If you look at it, it had beautiful symmetry, a modern, sleek design. It was space age. It was one of the first domes ever created. And this was built for the future. Until it wasn't. See, it turned out that these light panels made it impossible to catch a fly ball. These little windows that they had up there, every time that there was a fly ball, an outfielder could not see it because of the glare coming off of the window. It also turned out that the stadium couldn't handle the combination of body heat and sunshine coming in through the windows. And so there was a simple solution: paint it. And by painting it, they would make it reflective on top, they would insulate it a little bit, and it would cool things down while also allowing the outfielders to catch fly balls, right? So they painted it. The problem is, if you paint the windows, you don't get photosynthesis. So now they had to invent something called AstroTurf. And if you're not familiar with AstroTurf, it was basically like cement with carpet on top. It was a nightmare. Now, the truth is that Astrodome didn't last very long because it wasn't built for baseball. It was built for the future. And I share that because there's a danger in futurism. That same year that I was in the 8th grade, I had a different teacher who called us all up to the front of the room, held out this thing called a laser disc and said, "This will transform learning forever. In the future, you will go to a pod, you'll grab a laser disc and you'll get on-demand learning telling you exactly what you need at all times." And I remember him saying, "You won't even need teachers." And I found that to be so tragic at the time because I loved his class. I loved the labs that we did. And I loved the projects that I was doing in Mrs. Smoot and Mr. Darrow's class. And I didn't want to give that up. And I share this because there is a danger of futurism as we focus on the skills that our students will need in the future. If we think about it this way, the AI revolution is already here. We see it with ChatGPT, with machine learning, with generative AI. I won't get into it too much, but it's been making some waves in our culture, right? And there is the promise that smart machines will transform learning forever. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a danger with things like AI. And this danger is a futuristic embrace of artificial intelligence. This is the notion of saying, let's let the technology transform the learning. What happens is you slip into the Astrodome effect. We cannot predict the future. And just because you can automate something doesn't mean you should. So our students will need deeply human skills in a world of AI, but they'll also need critical skills that machines can do. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean is your kids will need to become really good at the things that machines can't do and really different at the things that machines can do. So really good at the things machines can't do, really different with the things that machines can do. So that's one trap. The second trap is the lock it and block it approach. This is the trap that says AI is here and we are going to do everything possible to ban it, to stop it, to ignore it, to fight it. But I think there's a third option, and this is the human approach. And this is the concept of gaining those critical skills that students will need to navigate that maze. It's things like becoming a problem solver, engaging in iterative thinking, growing empathetic, becoming a systems thinker, learning how to think differently, being ready for the creative economy. When Google wanted to figure out what allows people to become great at their jobs, what are the critical factors? The assumption was that it would be your degree. And in particular, it would be what university you go to. And what they found was that there was actually no association between what university you went to and your success at Google. Now, is this true of every company? No. I'm just quoting what Google found. And what they did find was that it was all about being a good coach, communicating and listening well, possessing insights into others, having empathy, and being supportive of one's colleagues. Notice how similar what you just read was to what I shared in the chat. Listening came up, understanding and media literacy, grit, adaptability, creativity, problem solving, collaboration, empathy, learning how to listen, teaching others. Those are the things that are in the chat. And that's similar to what Google said was necessary to be successful at their company. When they looked at teams and they studied it in Project Aristotle, they found that the key factors were equality, generosity, curiosity toward the ideas of others, empathy, and emotional intelligence. Now, some people will call these soft skills. I don't like the term soft skills. And I don't like the term soft skills partly because the history of the term soft skills is that they were largely developed to sort of discredit some of the skills that were viewed as more feminine. So for that reason, I'm not a fan of that term, but also there's nothing soft about these skills. They're really hard to develop. These are essential skills. I can tell you, as I think about my oldest right now, empathy has been a lifelong skill that we've had to work toward developing in him. It didn't come natural. It hasn't been easy for him. And he's really focused on how to be more empathetic and how to be more open to the ideas of others, right? On the other hand, when he was struggling with differential equations, that was pretty easy for me to help him at. I would argue empathy is harder than differential equations. These are human skills, and our students will need human skills to navigate this maze. They will need to be, for example, self-directed, to be self-starters and self-managers. There's been interesting studies done on metacognition and sort of the idea of how well you think about thinking. And what they found was that metacognition is the driver of self-direction, and that students who are more self-directed with higher levels of metacognition are far more likely to finish a four-year degree. They're far less likely to drop out of their first year of college. And they're also far more likely to finish at a trade school. So whether kids go to a trade school or a university, self-direction is critical. Can they be self-starters? Can they be self-managers? I'm going to give a quick example of where I love self-direction that I've seen at my own kids' school. One of the rules that they have, and my daughter does track, my sons both do baseball, is they have a rule that athletes are the ones who handle all communication. So as a parent, I do not contact the coach. My kids contact the coach. If I have an issue, I'm worried about playtime or something like that, my kids have to set up their own meeting with their coaches to ask, what do I need to do to increase my playing time? When it comes to things like the schedule, how to get on time, making sure that you have all your equipment, athletes are supposed to do all of that work themselves. And I love it. Now, what does this look like? It means in 7th and 8th grade, and then later in freshman year, they do the same thing. Day one, they meet in teams and they come up with how to create checklists for themselves, how to set timers on their phones for themselves, how to set up a Google Calendar with all of the dates of practices, meets, games, and how to share those with parents, guardians, aunts, uncles, whoever needs access to the schedule. And then they are expected to know that. Freshman year, they come up with their plan. Sophomore year, they begin to modify their plan, and they then are expected to sort of teach and lead that process with the freshmen when they're all together in one room. And then junior and senior year, they're just expected to implement it and practice it. So what does this mean in terms of student agency? It's a shift from just compliance, I'm doing something because I have to, or engagement, I'm doing something because I want to, and toward empowerment, I'm doing something out of a sense of buy-in and ownership. So this is the concept that if we talk about preparing students for the future, whether it is with agency, self-direction, whether it's divergent thinking, creativity, it's the concept that the best way to prepare students for the future is by empowering them in the present. Now, if we think about this in the classroom, that's a main focus, right? Self-directed learning, project-based learning, things like that. But I would love for you in the chat, if you would, just share what are some ways that parents can empower students in the present to prepare them for the future. So building some of that self-direction at home. And just share in the chat if you would. Ooh, I love what Jessica shared. Ask questions like, what is your strategy for completing this project? Something about planning. Yeah, shared family calendar, putting their dates and activities, setting a daily schedule. One of the things that we dealt with at our house is between practices and activities and all these things that go on, we don't get to eat together as a family as often. And so what we did that was just a simple solution is meal prep. And so we freeze ground beef, shredded chicken, all these different ingredients. Then they can put together rice bowls, pasta bowls, quesadillas, things like that. And they cook their own dinner on most nights using the stuff for meal prep. And then we just have a rotating schedule that they put together of who's going to cook the ground beef or the shredded chicken or whatever for the meal prep. And it's giving them that sense of ownership over something as simple as prepping for your meals, which fits into what Linda brought up about establishing the weekly diet, right? I love what Melissa said about they're afraid to make phone calls. I'm going to share one of my favorite examples of this. And this comes across in things like project-based learning. My friend Trevor was a project-based learning teacher in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And one of the things that he did is he had his students communicate with the community. So when they did a documentary and they wanted to have it on a screen at a local theater, he taught them how to cold call and how to make phone calls to all of these different movie theaters until they could get one that would say yes. And he described how, some of his students were literally crying over the fact that they would have to make phone calls. But that's it, getting them to schedule something. It was a similar thing where with my oldest two who are in high school, I required them to make phone calls to set up their doctor appointments. So I'll remind them, hey, you need to go to the dentist, and you need to make that phone call to set up the dentist appointment. And it sounds small, but it is a big deal in terms of what that's developing in kids. So what does this mean for students? There's a lot of different things. In a world of endless possibilities, our kids will have to be curious. So one of the things that becomes more important than ever is teaching kids how to ask great questions. If we think about artificial intelligence and its ability to answer great questions, asking important questions becomes more vital than ever. It's the concept of chasing your curiosity. Dan Meyer has some great ideas in math of getting people to learn how to ask questions based on looking at situations. One of the things that came up in the university where I work, so we have a really good engineering program, but one of the things that we realized is our students are really good at solving problems. They're not good at finding problems. They're good at answering questions. They struggled with asking great questions. And so when they got into their internships, and every one of them does internships starting in freshman year, when they got into these internships, they found that students struggled with finding problems and asking questions. And so now it has been a core part of what students need to learn in engineering, which is, how do you find problems? How do you find multiple routes? How do you go beyond your first solution that you have? And how do you look for the problems around you instead of just immediately solving them? The next idea that came across a lot in the research, that also people brought up in the chat: in a connected world, our students will need empathy. This is the notion of really getting into the shoes of other people, listening to where they're coming from, and focusing on really hearing one another. When I taught middle school, 8th grade, we had an empathy-driven solution to a community graffiti problem. And students did needs assessments, they did data analysis, and in the end, the group that won came up with a solution that we would solve our graffiti problem by creating murals. And they had to present their solutions, each group, to sort of a Shark Tank type group, and they were terrified to do this. And they shared their solutions to a community activist, a small business owner, and the superintendent. And all three of those people listened to each pitch as they marketed their ideas. And I remember the winning group came up with a solution of murals. And it turned out to be highly effective. We painted 8 murals over 3 years. It's also the notion of collaboration. One of the things that we have seen, I saw anecdotally, and now there's been a lot of data coming out, is coming out of COVID and social isolation, students have really struggled with collaboration. And empathy is a critical part of this. Can you understand where other people are coming from? So even though group projects can be annoying, they can be frustrating, they can be hard, I would argue it's really important that we find these moments for collaboration, because they will need that as they navigate the maze. We think about navigating the maze often through the lens of one person doing this by themselves, but really you're going to be going through the maze with other people there. And when you hit a dead end in the maze, you're going to sometimes have to lean on others and ask for advice to get through the maze. As you find your own process, you're going to have to work with others. The next idea is, faced with big challenges, our students need to be divergent thinkers. So generative AI is really good at creating solutions, but there's certain things it struggles with: voice, empathy, context, and all of that plays into divergent thinking. If you're not familiar with divergent thinking, it's sort of the notion of thinking outside the box by repurposing the box. And so it's the concept of working within creative constraints to solve problems. And again, in an era of algorithms, students will need to be divergent thinkers. If AI can do it, you will need to do it differently. And that's where the divergent thinking comes in. So what does this look like? There's all kinds of different ways. It could be linguistic divergent thinking. It can be visual, which is something like this. Comes from a Turing test, from a Torrance test, and it's done with shapes. It can be kinesthetic, where you give people a limited number of options. You can limit your materials, limit your time. And again, I would argue a lot of what's happening here is similar to what I experienced with middle school, where I had to work within those constraints in that History Day project limited materials to solve my problem. And then finally, the last big idea is, in a world of constant change, our students will need to be adaptable. That's where that slack to create grit becomes so important. The freedom to make mistakes mixed with the high expectations that you will reach to the highest level. One of the things that I remember hearing about, and I kind of struggle with it because I'm in this generation, was the description of how we've gone from helicopter parenting to snowplow parent. And I don't think that that's a fair assessment. I certainly think a lot of parents are willing to let their kids struggle. But I do think that we've seen this a little bit. We've seen the tendency to remove barriers to make things easier for kids to get through. And adaptability really is all about not always removing the barriers. It's about allowing someone to fall down a little bit and to get back up and to try again and to be more adaptable. This doesn't mean that we embrace failure, right? Failure is permanent, but failing is temporary. There's a term for people who embrace failure. It's called the Detroit Lions, right? We don't want that. So what you're doing here is you're learning that failing is a part of the learning process. This is especially true for high achievers. When we think about kids who are trying to get into elite universities, when we try to think about students who are valedictorians, one of the things that they run into is the risk aversion of perfectionism. It's the notion of it has to be perfect. And it's the notion that your first attempt needs to be perfect. So what happens in some cases is that students who are coming from that mindset develop that, what Carol Dweck would describe as a fixed mindset, and then they run into challenges in college and they fall apart because they don't know what to do with failing and with the temporary side of making mistakes and going through iterations towards success. I mentioned baseball before, but I'm going to share for me a proud dad moment. My middle son loves the game of baseball, and he is the cleanup hitter. So he bats number 4. And he had one game where he kind of struggled at the plate a little bit, and he went out and he practiced and he practiced and he practiced. And then it was the next game. And after his second at bat, he struck out. So first at bat, a strikeout, second at bat, he strikes out. And I was never more proud of him than in that moment. In terms of baseball, this was my most proud moment was his second strikeout. And the reason I was proud is that he walked back to the dugout with his head held high, and he looked at his coach and he said, "My swing is off. If there's any way possible that you could tell me how to improve it, I would love to meet with you." And I heard him talking to his coach. And although he got pulled from the game and he was taken out of the lineup, he did not leave the game. He volunteered to take score. He volunteered to catch for the pitcher who was warming up. He went and he shagged foul balls that were hit out of play. He grabbed equipment. He was working nonstop from the 5th inning all the way to the 7th inning. He was the first one out on the field to clean up at the end of the game and work on the field. And I was proud of him in this moment because my goal for him is to be adaptable. He's probably not going to become a professional baseball player, right? I know that. But what he will become, hopefully, is someone who is adaptable and who will continue to try and learn and to cheer others on when he faces a dead end in the maze. This is the concept that every mistake is another iteration that takes you closer and closer to success. And it's the idea that we can celebrate creative risk taking. So in the end, the big idea is simply this, that if we want to prepare students for the future, one of our best ways to get there is by empowering them with that voice and choice in the present, so that they can gain those critical human skills that they'll use in every domain of life. All right, I would love for some questions, if anyone has questions.
That's wonderful, John. Really wonderful information. It's exactly what we all want for our children. Outstanding. Really, really outstanding. Enjoyed every minute of it. John, what do you think is the biggest mistake that parents make and that teachers make?
I think in this area of empowering students, it's we don't like to watch someone fail, and I think we provide help too soon. And there's a lot of good research on this. Again, to Carol Dweck, her work, some of what Adam Grant has come up with connected to it. If you've ever read the book Originals, similar kind of idea. We don't like to watch someone struggle, and really embracing the idea of productive struggle. They're going to need that in the maze.
Sean, I was really struck by your line. You said that empathy is harder than differential equations. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that is?
Because differential equations are a really clear, discrete skill, and it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's hard both conceptually and procedurally, but empathy is a skill. It's also a habit. It's also a mindset. It's deeply intellectual and also emotional. It's both, and that is so much harder. And I gotta say, I want to be clear. Differential equations were really hard for me in calculus, so I get it. It's not easy. I don't want to minimize that, but I only share it because empathy is only that much harder.
John, we hosted Carol Dweck a long time ago.
Oh,
Would you very briefly tell families a little bit about her research and how she got to where her conclusion that she reached about a positive mindset, growth mindset?
First of all, I am amazed at some of the people that you have. You're like, we had Carol Dweck, we had Susan Cain, all these people that I look up to. Yeah, I mean, her research, and I don't want to misquote it at all, but she was looking at the fixed and growth mindsets that students have, and the role of what happens with the feedback we give, with the downside of praise that can happen when we praise inherent talent rather than praising for effort. And that's the critical idea. How they came about with the actual studies were really interesting, especially how well they were able to do it from an experimental side. So I don't want to get too much into the methodology, but it was really interesting, because so much of what we have in education and psychology data will be survey data or qualitative, but this was truly done in an experimental role, and it is fascinating work.
It really is such counterintuitive stuff that as a parent, you want to say, look how smart you are and how that can backfire. And so look at that effort that you're putting in. So much of what you talked about, the learning empathy, what do you think what's the role of role modeling in a parent and a teacher?
For empathy, you said?
Empathy. Let's talk about empathy specifically.
Yeah, I think pointing it out, talking about it, role playing it at different times can be important. With your own kids, if they have siblings, I think empathy within siblings becomes really important. There will be disagreement, we talk about when you step into too early with struggle. I think the same thing can happen where we as parents sometimes step in too early with conflict and solve conflict for kids rather than facilitating a productive struggle that involves empathy. It's hard. And some kids, it's easier for them.
Yeah.
Some, I mean, I mentioned my oldest, he just had a tough time with other people's perspectives, sort of the perspective taking side of empathy. He's very well self-regulated, so he didn't understand when other people he thought had too much of an emotional reaction or things like that. And when I mean other people, I mean his younger sister. Moments like that. And I think not stepping in too early, I think modeling it in terms of the dialogue, the conversation, and then of course our actions become important. Kids obviously listen so much to what adults are saying to each other. And, like I'll just give a small example. I've never seen adults that don't engage in some level of gossip. Like we all talk about other people behind their back. But if there's empathy brought into it, that includes, hey, where are they coming from? What's going on? That's powerful, rather than judgment. It's hard.
Yeah. Kids hear 1% of everything you say and 100% of everything you do. That's what you just said.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're reminding me about one of my favorites, Madeline Levine. Do not do for your child what they can do for themselves. Do not do for your child what they can almost do for themselves. And that to me is the biggest struggle, that wanting to spare them from the pain. And then you so beautifully, reminded us that it is the struggle and that's the learning. Can we talk about AI a little bit? When you first knew that was coming on the horizon, what were your thoughts about that? I'd love to know.
Yeah, so I think I had the benefit of sort of seeing some of the more generative style of AI, definitely seeing some of the deep learning side of machine learning, how it's modeled on neural networks, just in visiting. Sorry, I thought I had silenced my phone and the dings are from text. Probably around 2016 or so is really when I started to see it, and visiting certain universities that were doing really interesting work around that type of AI, especially with things like AI tutors, AI feedback, that side of things in the education realm. And my concerns with AI were not, I think, what a lot of professors were worried about. I worry less about cheating than a lot of people I know. My worry was actually with that struggle thing that I brought up. In other words, if you can get instant feedback, that's great. That's necessary for learning. But struggle and confusion are also necessary for learning. And if it gets in the way of struggle and confusion, that concerns me a little bit. So those were kind of my initial concerns. As I started to really dive into AI and talk with people about AI, one of the things is my slide said, the AI revolution. It really has been an AI evolution. And I think the thing to remember about AI is it's simply complex algorithms. If we think about it this way, earlier forms of AI were things like spell check. It's totally normal. There are the social media we use there, all these things. I had a friend of mine who said, I would never trust AI to, give me answers in terms of ChatGPT. And he was just weirded out by the fact that I use ChatGPT like the TV show Chopped, kind of, I give it random ingredients, ask it to come up with a recipe that takes 15 minutes or less to make, right? busy dad doing stuff. And he said, I would never do that. And then I reminded him that, he met his wife on a dating app. That's AI, right? Like you and your wife met, 15 years ago on a dating app, and it's no different. And so I think when we think about AI as this is just another iteration, it becomes a lot less scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know, did I take us too far off there?
No, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
There's just a question here. I think we covered it, but what do you think? What is a method to work with students who are critical of others?
Ooh, yeah. So I'm actually going to share something that I use. Sorry, let me find this. And as I look for it real quick, one of the first things is, having norms is important, having rules, guidelines when they're overly critical to each other. I've done things like having contracts for students where groups form contracts related to the norms that they have. But another thing is there's a danger for students who are too critical toward others, but there's also equally a danger of students who can't embrace criticism, who struggle with critical feedback. So I use this little thing that I created for my students at the middle school level, and now I use it at the college level. So what we have is, if I trust you, if there's high trust and it's positive feedback, that's affirmation. If there's high trust and there's negative feedback, it doesn't feel good, but that's critical feedback, and that's really important. If there's negative feedback and low trust, then that's hating, and we don't want that. And then if there's, sorry, my plug, I need to plug in my computer. Thought I would have a little more time on this.
It's telling you that it's time to say goodnight, so we'll let you finish.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry about this. So what I would say is, and then if there's low trust, we have obviously, hating, and we have flattery. And I think it's important to recognize this, because when students really understand that the critical feedback isn't being mean, that becomes really helpful. And that if you feel like someone is being too harsh, too mean in their feedback, then that's a chance to review the norms, or to go back and look at the trust levels and really say, is there trust back and forth between students? So I use this as a little tool to kind of remind us of trusted feedback's important, whether it feels good or not. And so hopefully those things would help a little bit with this idea.
And the flattery has to be specific and authentic, doesn't it? You can't, right? Right.
It's got to be, specific. It's got to be practical. It's got to be helpful. All of those things. And that's where modeling feedback becomes really important as well.
I'm seeing lots of people who are emailing me and saying, what a great hour. And they've learned, yep, there it is. John, thank you so very much. I know our Glenbard District 87 teachers who will be a part of D87 Fest are really in for a treat tomorrow. So I'm so looking forward to it, hearing you again. And it's so kind of you to let us share this out. I really appreciate it on our YouTube channel. Okay, everybody, this is where we go hug the kids, John. And so we'll go do that. And we'll say goodnight, and thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Jerica. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.